Chapter 1. The glassworks of the East End. The relentless, soot-laden black rain of London's East End poured mercilessly over the dilapidated grey slate roofs of the impoverished industrial district. It pooled into filthy, oil-slicked puddles that filled the uneven, muddy gaps between the jagged cobblestones of the narrow streets. In the damp, freezing air, thick with the pungent stench of sulphur drifting from the nearby eastern docks, the Grimshaw and Sons glassworks loomed like a monstrous beast. Its towering brick chimney belched thick, dark columns of grey smoke into the leaden sky, casting a permanent shadow over the miserable tenements below. Inside the smelting workshop, the stifling heat radiating from the massive furnaces made the air heavy, suffocating, and almost impossible to breathe. Brilliant red sparks shot out from the crucibles of molten glass, glittering like miniature shooting stars against the dim, cavernous shadows of the rafters. The deafening, rhythmic clang of iron hammers striking metal clashed with the low, menacing roar of fires burning at thousands of degrees, creating a chaotic and terrifying industrial symphony. At a battered oak workbench reinforced with rusted iron bands, Lavinia Montague, working under the alias Vini, stood in silence. Her ash-gray eyes were locked in intense concentration on a newly cooled sheet of ruby-red glass. On her delicate face, smudged with charcoal dust and sweat, an unyielding resolve was etched, defying the exhaustion of 12 consecutive hours of grueling labor. Her slender hands that had once held fine goose quills to sketch intricate designs on smooth vellum in the sun-drenched drawing rooms of Pembroke Manor, were now marred by tiny, jagged scars from glass shards and calloused from holding the heavy diamond-tipped cutting tool. Carefully, with absolute precision, she guided the diamond blade along a complex, sweeping curve on the colored glass. A sharp, clean hiss echoed from the tool, signaling a flawless cut. She tapped the underside of the sheet with a wooden mallet, and the ruby piece separated smoothly, leaving a pristine, perfect edge without a single fracture. She let out a soft sigh, lifting her forearm to wipe the sweat trickling down her temple, leaving a faint dark smudge across her pale skin. In the quiet theater of her mind, memories of her former life of luxury at Pembroke Manor flashed with painful clarity. She remembered the warm spring afternoons when she sat beside her father, Sir Kenneth Montague, watching him sketch exquisite stained glass patterns destined for royal palaces. Her father had always told her that stained glass was not merely decoration, but a sacred lens that filtered divine light to bring hope to weary souls. Yet, all that light and hope had been brutally extinguished by the ruthless greed and envy of Viscount George Radcliffe. The Viscount had falsely accused her father of intentionally damaging the Westminster Cathedral's grand window to seize their family estate, dragging their name through the mud and plunging them into absolute ruin. 2 years had passed since her father died suddenly in the damp, freezing cells of the Bow Street prison. The pain of that loss remained an unhealed wound in Lavinia's heart, aching with every breath she took. Their properties were confiscated, the family estate was sold off to pay fabricated debts, and Lavinia and her younger brother Leo were cast out by Mayfair society as if they carried a plague. They had to flee the relentless pursuit of heartless creditors, hiding in the dark, crime-ridden slums of the East End. To protect Leo from being sent to a brutal parish workhouse, Lavinia was forced to conceal her noble heritage, taking up work as a common glass cutter at Grimshaw's factory for a pittance. She swore a silent oath to herself that she would protect Leo at all costs, perfect her knowledge of chemical glass formulas, and one day restore her father's stolen honor. In a dimly lit corner of the workshop, away from the heat of the furnace, 12-year-old Leo Montague sat on a wooden crate. His soft brown curls were dusted with ash, and his intelligent eyes were focused on a rough scrap of paper, where he was carefully sketching a delicate rose motif. Leo was a gentle, obedient boy who had inherited their father's extraordinary artistic gift. Knowing how hard his sister worked to keep them alive, he did his best to help, sweeping up glass shards and sorting the lead cames by thickness. Every stroke of his charcoal pencil was fueled by the hope of one day returning to a peaceful life. "Vini," Leo called out softly, his voice slightly hoarse from the constant dust and coal smoke. He walked over to her side, his small face pinched with worry. "Mr. Grimshaw told the lead fitters that he might cut our coal ration in half for the back room this week. I don't mind the cold, but I'm worried about you. That cough you got last winter hasn't fully gone away, and our room is always so damp." Lavinia set down her cutting tool. She stepped toward her brother, gently wiping a smudge of soot from his cheek with her thumb, and offered him a warm, reassuring smile. Do not worry, Leo. I have managed to save a bit of pin money by preparing the special cobalt blue formula for Mr. Grimshaw. It will be more than enough to buy extra coal to keep us warm until spring. Focus on your drawing, my dear. Your lines are much smoother today, and the petals look almost alive. I am so proud of you. Their brief moment of peace was shattered when the rusted iron bell, hanging above the heavy wooden workshop door, rang violently. Gideon Grimshaw, the stout, greasy-faced owner of the glassworks, scurried into the room, bowing obsequiously before two aristocratic visitors, who had just stepped down from a luxurious carriage bearing the Radcliffe crest. The man leading the way was none other than Lord Archibald Ravensdale, the uncle of the current Duke of Ravensdale, and a close ally of the man who had ruined her father. Following closely behind him was his arrogant manager, Silas. Archibald held a lace handkerchief to his nose to block the sulphurous air, his small, bead-like eyes scanning the filthy workshop with undisguised disgust. When his gaze fell upon Lavinia standing by her workbench, his expression hardened into immediate revulsion. "Grimshaw," Archibald Ravensdale spoke, his voice high-pitched and dripping with condescension. "Is this the wretched, filthy establishment you claimed could supply the stained glass for the Ravensdale Abbey restoration? Look at this place. You are reduced to employing destitute girls from the slums. How can someone so low, with hands caked in soot and grease, produce glass worthy of a sacred chapel? Those ruby-red pieces look cheap, dull, and utterly lifeless. A hovel like this should stick to blowing beer bottles for drunken sailors." Grimshaw bowed even lower, his voice trembling with fear. "My lord, Venie is the most skilled cutter in all of London. She possesses unique coloring formulas that no other workshop can replicate. That ruby glass is of the highest purity. Silence." Archibald snapped. He marched toward Lavinia's workbench, sneering at her. Without warning, he raised his silver-topped cane and struck the wooden rack supporting her freshly cut glass. A sharp, agonizing crash echoed through the workshop as the ruby-red panes Lavinia had spent 3 days meticulously crafting fell to the stone floor, shattering into hundreds of glittering shards at her feet. Leo let out a frightened cry, burying his face in his sister's skirt. The broken glass gleamed in the firelight like drops of fresh blood spilled on the dirty floor. The Duke's salvation. The following afternoon, the heavy rain finally subsided into a cold, damp mist that hung low over the narrow cobblestone streets of the East End. A carriage of polished black lacquer, devoid of any gaudy family crests but radiating an undeniable aura of absolute authority, pulled up outside the Grimshaw Glassworks. It was drawn by 4 magnificent black stallions, their coats shining like satin in the pale light of the fading sun. From the carriage stepped Dominic Ravensdale, the Duke of Ravensdale. The 29-year-old Duke, a former commander of the Royal Artillery known for his uncompromising discipline, looked like a monument of living power. He wore a dark, heavy wool cloak lined with gold thread at the collar, his sharp features cast in granite, and his cool gray eyes possessing the piercing gaze of a man accustomed to presiding over the highest courts. Dominic entered the workshop with slow, deliberate steps that echoed heavily against the stone floor. The oppressive heat and chaotic noise of the glassworks seemed to freeze instantly under his icy command. Grimshaw threw himself to the ground, his forehead pressed against the dirt-caked floor, not daring to look up at the most powerful nobleman in Yorkshire. At the Duke's entry, every glass-blower and apprentice dropped their tools, bowing their heads in breathless silence. Dominic did not spare a glance for the cowering owner. His gray eyes swept over the workshop, finally landing on the pile of broken ruby glass, and the young woman who was calmly sweeping the shards near the workbench, Lavinia. Despite her coarse, stained work clothes and the ash on her cheeks, her proud posture, the defiant tilt of her chin, and her straight back immediately caught his attention. She stood out like a wild rose growing amidst a pile of industrial ash, entirely untouched by the fear that paralyzed everyone else. Dominic spoke, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the hiss of the furnace. "Gideon Grimshaw, my uncle claims that your establishment lacks the capacity to supply the stained glass for Ravensdale Abbey, and has proposed transferring the contract to Lord George's workshop in Westminster. However, upon reviewing the financial ledgers, I discovered unusual deficits and a severe drop in glass quality. I came to inspect the quality myself, and it seems I have found the source of your incompetence in this pile of ruined glass." Lavinia stood up, brushing the glass dust from her hands. She stepped forward to face the Duke, showing none of the submissive hesitation of the other workers. Looking directly into his cold gray eyes, She spoke with a voice that was clear, steady, and filled with quiet authority. "Your Grace, if you employ Lord George's Westminster workshop for the Abbey on the windswept northern cliffs, every pane of glass will crack and shatter within 3 winters. The Westminster glass is made from sand with high iron content, which gives it a muddy green tint and makes it extremely brittle in low temperatures. Only the pure silica sand from Ravensdale Bay, melted with a precise ratio of potash, can withstand the salt air and fierce North Sea gales. Your uncle wishes to transfer the contract only to conceal the fact that he has been illegally selling the estate's pure sand to commercial brickworks for personal profit. You should trust physical science and raw facts, Your Grace, rather than the calculated advice of your relatives." Dominic narrowed his eyes, surprised by her precise knowledge of geology and glass chemistry. He had never met a woman, let alone in the slums of the East End, who could analyze silicate structures and geographic mineralogy with such sharp confidence. He stepped closer to her workbench, examining the broken ruby shards. As his gaze lingered on her slender fingers, his eyes caught the gleam of a gold signet ring depicting the Montague Fire Eagle, a ring she had temporarily exposed while holding up a shard of red glass to illustrate her point. Dominic's eyes dilated and his chest tightened. That ring, it was the unique heirloom of the Montague family. Her father, Sir Kenneth Montague, was the royal artisan who had designed the private chapel window for Dominic's mother before she passed away. Dominic had never forgotten Sir Kenneth's dedication and noble character, nor had he forgotten the injustice of his tragic death in prison. A wave of regret and long-suppressed grief washed over him. Dominic took a step closer, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. He reached out and firmly but gently took her wrist, pulling her hand into the light of the furnace to examine the ring. Lavinia gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip was ironclad, yet careful not to hurt her. "You are Sir Kenneth Montague's daughter?" Dominic asked, his voice dropping to a low, quiet intensity that vibrated with rare emotion. "Lavinia Montague, why are you here, hiding under a false name in a wretched workshop, living in such squalor? Why did you not seek my aid when the disaster struck? I have searched for you for 2 years." Lavinia met his gaze, her ash-gray eyes shining with fierce pride and distant coldness. "Your Grace, when my father was falsely accused, the entirety of Mayfair society turned their backs on us to preserve their own reputations. I had no desire to beg for the temporary charity or pity of any duke. I can support myself and my brother with my own hands and knowledge. Pity cannot wash away the stain on my father's honor. I seek a fair business partner, Your Grace, not a savior." Dominic stared into her eyes, seeing the same unbreakable spirit and noble dignity of his late mentor. A profound respect rose within him. He released her wrist, stood tall, and announced in a voice that left no room for argument, "I do not offer you pity, Lavinia. I offer you a fair contract based on your extraordinary talent. Ravensdale Abbey requires a massive stained glass window depicting the resurrection in the main sanctuary to fulfill my late mother's final wish, and it must be completed within 4 weeks. My uncle Archibald is using every legal maneuver to halt this project to strip me of the estate. If you can design and complete this masterpiece, I will sign a formal petition to clear your father's name before the House of Lords, restore the Montague estate in Yorkshire, and place your brother under my personal guardianship to attend the Royal Academy. From this day forth, you are the head artisan of the Ravensdale Abbey restoration, under my direct protection. No one, not even my uncle, shall touch you or your brother again. You shall have full command of the workmen." Lavinia looked at the stern Duke, recognizing the sincerity and protective resolve in his gray eyes. She gave a firm nod. The contract was forged, opening a new chapter of peril and hope. They would leave the East End behind and face the storms of the North. Chapter 3. The desolate Ravensdale Abbey. The heavy carriage of the Ravensdale family rattled along the steep, treacherous winding road that led to the summit of the cliffs on the North Yorkshire coast, where the ancient stone structure of Ravensdale Abbey stood silhouetted against the dark, stormy sky. The northern heavens were a leaden expanse of churning gray clouds, and the wild white-capped waves of the North Sea crashed relentlessly against the sheer limestone cliffs below, filling the air with a deep echoing roar like distant thunder. The howling wind whipped through the old pine trees, bending their ancient branches and creating a melancholy, desolate atmosphere that was both breathtaking and deeply unsettling. As the abbey came into view, its massive stone walls, blackened in places by the mysterious fire that had ravaged it the previous year, rose like a silent fortress. The soaring Gothic window frames stood empty and hollow, allowing the freezing sea gales to sweep unchecked through the vaulted stone halls, whistling through the cracks in the masonry. A portion of the vaulted stone roof had collapsed, leaving the central nave exposed to the cold sky above. Lavinia stepped down from the carriage, her fingers tightly gripping the worn handle of the wooden chest, containing her glass-cutting tools and detailed sketchbooks. She took a deep breath, inhaling the sharp, salty air of the coast blended with the damp scent of pine and stone. Though the ruinous state of the abbey would have disheartened any ordinary artisan, Lavinia felt a surge of quiet excitement. To her eyes, those hollow dark window frames were not ruins, but vast blank canvases waiting to be filled with light, color, and history. She recalled her father's gentle voice, reminding her that every piece of stained glass placed in its proper alignment was like restoring a fragmented piece of a lost soul. Leo walked closely by her side, his wide, curious eyes staring up at the towering Gothic arches with a mixture of awe and apprehension. He reached out to squeeze his sister's hand, whispering, "Sister, it is so massive, yet it feels so sad. I hope we can make it beautiful and bright again." Dominic Ravensdale walked beside her, his long wool cloak billowing behind him in the wind. He gestured toward the main altar, where a network of temporary wooden scaffolding had been erected along the central arched window frame, which rose more than 30 feet above the stone floor. "This is where the Grand Resurrection window must be installed," Dominic said, his expression grim. "We have less than 4 weeks before the representatives of the House of Lords and the Archbishop of London arrive to inspect the restoration. If the window is not complete, and the chapel is not restored by then, my Uncle Archibald will have the legal grounds to declare that I have failed to fulfill my mother's bequest, and he will strip me of the Ravensdale estate. I require absolute perfection, Lavinia. Any delay, any mistake, will cost us both my inheritance and your family's hope of justice." Lavinia stepped into the cavernous sanctuary, placing her wooden chest on a dusty stone table near the altar. She ran her fingers over the cold stone of the windowsill, feeling the rough soot left by the fire. "The timeline is indeed short, Your Grace," she replied, looking up at the high arch. "But the greatest obstacle is not the time, it is the workmen. Look at them, they are exhausted, sullen, and have completely lost faith in this project. Without their cooperation, it is impossible to raise a masterpiece of this scale." Just then, a group of local craftsmen, their faces smudged with charcoal and their expressions hostile, gathered at the base of the scaffolding. Their leader, a broad-shouldered lead fitter named Thomas, who was notorious for his stubborn pride, stepped forward. He gave a cursory, disrespectful nod to the Duke and cast a mocking look at Lavinia and her toolbox. "Your Grace," Thomas spoke, his voice booming through the empty stone church. "My men and I have worked these estates for 2 generations. We cannot accept being ordered about by a slip of a girl from the London slums. Stained glass work is no task for the weak. It requires heavy lifting of lead frames and enduring the intense heat of the soldering iron. A woman simply lacks the physical constitution and the skill for such labor. Moreover, we have heard rumors that she is the daughter of the man who ruined the Westminster windows. We will not work under someone who brings bad luck to our home." The other workmen murmured in agreement, crossing their arms and glaring at Lavinia with open hostility. They viewed her as a fraud trading on her dead father's ruined name. Leo's face flushed with anger, and he took a step forward to defend his sister, but Lavinia placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, keeping him back. She walked directly up to Thomas, setting her toolbox on the table and opening it with calm deliberation. She reached inside and pulled out a length of lead cane and a pair of professional bending pliers. Looking straight into Thomas's eyes, her voice was steady and clear. "Mr. Thomas, physical strength does not determine the quality of a lead joint. If you rely solely on brute force to tighten the lead cane around the glass, without understanding how the metal expands and contracts in the freezing winds of the North Sea, every single pane will be crushed and cracked by the time winter peaks. A true master craftsman knows to leave a precise gap of 1/10 of an inch between the joints to allow for thermal movement, and uses a tin-to-lead ratio of 60-40 to ensure the solder remains elastic. Tell me, Mr. Thomas, did you know that if your tin content is too high, the joints will become brittle and snap under the pressure of a gale?" As she spoke, Lavinia's hands moved with astonishing speed and grace. With a few deft twists of her pliers, she bent the lead cane perfectly around a sample piece of glass, creating a smooth, flawless curve without a single kink or fracture in the metal. She placed the perfectly leaded glass before Thomas. "My father, Sir Kenneth Montague, devoted his life to this art, and he taught me never to bow before baseless slander. I came here not to boast of strength, but to ensure that Ravensdale Abbey stands for another 3 centuries. If you believe your strength is superior to my precision, then try bending this came under the cold wind outside. Prove your skill before you question mine. Thomas stared at the perfect sample, his face turning pale. He looked at Lavinia with a mixture of shock and deep respect. He and the other workmen recognized the touch of a master artisan, a level of skill they had never seen in Yorkshire. The arrogance of the workmen vanished, replaced by silent awe. Dominic Ravensdale, watching from the shadows, allowed a rare, subtle smile to touch his lips. He stepped forward, his presence commanding. From this moment on, Miss Montague's word is my command on this project. Anyone who refuses to obey her will be dismissed from the estate immediately. The workmen bowed their heads in submission, ready to work under the command of their new head artisan. Chapter 4. The Blizzard and the Soldering Flame. In the days that followed, the Yorkshire weather turned brutally severe. A massive blizzard swept in from the North Sea, burying the cliffs in deep snowdrifts and cutting off Ravensdale Abbey from the neighboring towns. Inside the stone walls of the abbey, the cold was biting, threatening to freeze the very water in their wash basins. Yet Lavinia worked without pause in the small vestry she had converted into a laboratory. A small kiln used to melt solder and jars of metallic oxides provided a meager warmth, but it was not enough to keep her fingers from turning red and stiff. She refused to stop, driven by the looming deadline. She spent hours weighing cobalt oxide, copper oxide, and gold salts on her brass scales, her breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. The frost formed intricate lace patterns on the small glass panes of the vestry windows, matching the drawings on her desk. She wrapped a thick woolen shawl tightly around her shivering shoulders, but her focus never wavered. Her thoughts returned to Pembroke Manor, where her father had once explained the chemistry of light. Light, Lavinia, is the breath of God, he had said, his eyes reflecting the warm furnace. And glass is the body that holds it. You must treat it with respect. Late that night, the storm reached its peak. The wind howled through the stone battlements like a chorus of angry spirits. Lavinia was carefully measuring out cobalt oxide to create the deep blue glass that would form the background of the resurrection scene. Suddenly, she heard a strange, heavy crashing sound coming from the castle library, located down a long stone corridor connecting the abbey to the main residence. It was followed by the sound of shattering glass and low, choked gasping. Fearing for the Duke's safety, Lavinia lit a beeswax candle, sheltering the flame with her hand, and hurried down the dark, freezing hallway. The stone corridor was drafty, the tiny flame of her candle dancing precariously and casting monstrous shadows of the Gothic archways onto the damp stone walls. When she pushed open the heavy oak door of the library, she was shocked by the scene before her. Dominic Ravensdale was kneeling on the dark mahogany floor. His heavy ducal cloak lay discarded in the corner, and several leather-bound books and a crystal vase lay shattered around him. The Duke's sharp face was deathly pale, sweat beaded on his forehead, and his usually cold gray eyes were wide with intense panic. He was breathing in rapid, shallow gasps, his hands clutching his head as if trying to block out some invisible horror. Dominic was trapped in the grip of a severe post-traumatic episode, a lingering scar from his years commanding the Royal Artillery in the bloody campaigns of the Peninsular War. The booming thunder of the storm and the howling wind had mimicked the deafening roar of heavy cannons and the screams of dying men. In his mind, he was no longer in Yorkshire. He was standing in the mud and smoke of a burning battlefield, surrounded by the ghosts of his fallen soldiers whom he could not save. He could hear the screams of his men, the explosions of French shells, and the desperate cries for help that he had been powerless to answer. "Stay back," Dominic roared, his voice hoarse and raw with agony. He did not see Lavinia, he saw only a shape moving through the imaginary smoke of his memories. His chest heaved violently, and his hands shook as he pushed himself backward against the wall. Lavinia did not retreat. She placed the candle on a nearby table and walked slowly, deliberately toward him. She knelt on the cold floor in front of him, keeping her distance so as not to startle him, but remaining close enough for him to feel her warmth. "Your Grace, Dominic," Lavinia said, her voice dropping to a gentle, soothing tone that carried a profound warmth, like sunlight breaking through ice. "You are safe. You are at Ravensdale. The noise you hear is only the snow and wind against the windows. There are no cannons here. There is no enemy. Look at me, Dominic. Focus on my voice. It is Lavinia." Dominic's wild gaze slowly focused on her face, illuminated by the warm glow of the candle. Hearing her calm, steady voice and catching the scent of dried lavender and pine that always clung to her clothes, the rapid beating of his heart began to slow. Lavinia slowly extended her hands, palms up, offering him a connection if he was ready. Dominic hesitated, his breath shuddering, before he reached out and took her hands. Her skin was rough in places from her labor, but her touch was incredibly warm and grounding. The physical contact acted as an anchor, drawing him out of the dark recesses of his memories. Slowly, he leaned forward, resting his forehead against her shoulder, his breathing gradually steadying as he breathed in her scent. Lavinia gently stroked his hair, continuing to speak in soft, quiet tones, telling him about how glass filtered the harsh light of the world to make it beautiful. Her words were a balm to his scarred mind. When the Duke finally recovered his composure, he slowly released her hands and stood up, a brief flash of embarrassment crossing features before it was replaced by a deep, quiet gratitude. "I apologize that you had to witness that, Lavinia," Dominic said, his voice returning to its usual deep gravity, though it was softer now. "It is a relic of Spain. I have not suffered such an attack in some time." Lavinia smiled gently, picking up his cloak and draping it over his shoulders. "You have no need to apologize for the scars you carry in service to your country, Your Grace. The body may heal, but the mind requires time to find peace. The kiln in my workshop is always burning with a gentle flame. If you find sleep elusive, you are welcome to sit by the fire and watch the metals melt. Stained glass has a way of quietening the spirit." As Dominic watched her walk back down the dark corridor, a strange, unfamiliar warmth stirred in his chest. The proud glass artisan was not only rebuilding his mother's chapel, she was slowly, piece by piece, repairing the shattered fragments of his own soul. The storm continued to howl outside, but within the castle, a quiet peace had taken root. Chapter 5: The Cold Dinner. 2 days after the blizzard had passed, the atmosphere inside Ravensdale Castle grew exceedingly tense. Lord Archibald Ravensdale, returning from London in a grand carriage, made an unannounced arrival at the estate to inspect the progress. In a desperate attempt to assert his authority and humiliate Dominic before the local gentry, Archibald had ordered the head housekeeper to prepare a grand formal dinner in the castle's banquet hall. He invited several neighboring aristocrats and members of the Yorkshire gentry who were visiting nearby. His true motive was to isolate the Duke, using social pressure to expose the presence of the low-born Lavinia as a vulgar stain on the Ravensdale name. The dinner was served on a massive 15-meter mahogany table, under the warm, flickering glow of dozens of beeswax candles set in towering sterling silver candelabras, each engraved with the ancient family crest. Exquisite English dishes, Yorkshire roast beef with rich gravy, rosemary roasted turkey, and delicate truffle soupware served on gold-rimmed Sevres porcelain. Yet, despite the luxury, the cavernous dining hall felt suffocatingly cold, and a heavy, tense silence hung over the guests. Dominic Ravensdale sat at the head of the table, his posture as rigid and imposing as ever, his face showing no emotion. At the opposite end sat Lord Archibald, who continuously made loud, condescending remarks throughout the meal. To the quiet shock of the guests, Dominic had placed Lavinia in the seat of honor immediately to his right. This arrangement infuriated Archibald and the local nobles, who viewed the presence of a common glass cutter at a noble table as a direct insult to their status. Lady Harriet, a snobbish baronet's wife sitting across from Lavinia, kept whispering to her neighbor, gesturing with her ivory fan. "To think a girl from the East End shop sits in the seat of honor," she murmured, loud enough for others to hear. "She smells of coal smoke and solder. Truly, the Duke's standards have collapsed since the old Duchess passed." Throughout the meal, the sharp scrape of silver cutlery against porcelain was the only sound that echoed in the hall. This uncomfortable silence was broken when Archibald slammed his crystal wineglass onto the table, a cold sneer forming on his face as he looked toward Lavinia, who was recreationally using her dinner utensils with perfect, understated grace. "Dominic, I must confess I cannot comprehend your management of this estate," Archibald spoke, his shrill voice echoing clearly across the room. "The restoration of Ravensdale Abbey is a sacred project, one that bears heavily upon our family's reputation in London. Yet, you have allowed a common, destitute girl from the East End, the daughter of a disgraced traitor who died in a Westminster cell, to sit at this honorable table. Look at her hands, scarred and calloused from manual labor. The very smell of grease and soot from the furnaces is ruining the aroma of this fine vintage. A creature of her class belongs in the kitchens eating moldy crusts, not dining with the peerage of England. You are dragging the Ravensdale crest through the mud, Dominic." Archibald's cruel words prompted several local ladies to hide their mocking smiles behind lace fans. Sitting beside his sister, Leo went pale, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his linen napkin, his eyes burning with tears of humiliation. Yet, Lavinia Montague did not flinch. She set down her knife and fork without making a sound, stood up and faced her accuser. Her shoulders were straight and her ash-gray eyes burned with a cool, sharp fire under the candlelight. "Lord Archibald," Lavinia began, her voice clear, melodious, and filled with an iron authority that silenced the table. "My scarred hands are the honorable mark of honest labor and creative intellect. My father, Sir Kenneth Montague, spent his life creating works of art that brought the light of heaven to the greatest cathedrals in the realm. The temporary poverty of my family does not tarnish the bloodline of the Montagues. My family's pedigree is as old and honorable as any house represented at this table. In my view, those who hide their intellectual emptiness behind noble titles, while secretly embezzling estate funds and stealing resources to pay off their gambling debts, are the ones who truly stain this society. A costly vintage of wine cannot mask the scent of a fraudulent soul, nor can it hide a coward's deeds." Archibald turned a furious shade of red, slamming his fist onto the table and preparing to call the estate guards to drag her out. The glasses on the table rattled violently, but before he could speak, Dominic Ravensdale stood up. The towering presence of the Duke immediately silenced the room, freezing the breath in the guests' throats. Dominic walked over to Lavinia's side. In front of the stunned assembly, he unclasped his heavy, gold-embroidered velvet ducal cloak and gently draped it over her shoulders to shield her from the draft. He then took her hand in his, deliberately displaying the Montague signet ring to the light. "Uncle Archibald," Dominic spoke, his voice dropping to an arctic calm that sent a shiver through the room. "Miss Montague is no common laborer for you to insult. She is the head artisan of Ravensdale Abbey, working under my personal protection and legal authority. Any insult directed at her honor or her family name is a direct challenge to the Duke of Ravensdale. This ducal cloak has defended the honor of my house for 3 centuries, and from this night forth, it shall defend her. If you find this table and my guests beneath your high standards, you are welcome to leave my castle immediately, even in the midst of this storm. I shall not prevent you." Dominic's cold, absolute declaration silenced the room completely. No one dared to mutter a single word of protest. His face pale with fury, Archibald stood up and stormed out of the banquet hall, vowing to ruin the Duke before the House of Lords. Lavinia looked down at the warm velvet cloak on her shoulders, feeling the deep protective warmth of the Duke's gesture. The unspoken bond between them had grown stronger than ever. Chapter 6. Secrets beneath the dust. Following the dramatic confrontation at the dinner table, Lavinia threw herself into her work with even greater intensity. She knew that the only way to defeat Archibald's schemes and restore her father's honor was to complete the massive resurrection window ahead of the House of Lords inspection. Her art was her only shield. The next morning, as pale winter sunlight filtered through the stone arches, Lavinia, Leo, and Thomas entered the old vestry behind the main altar. The room was dark, damp, and neglected, filled with stacks of old books and records covered in a thick layer of ash and soot from the previous year's fire. The air was heavy with the smell of charred wood and decaying parchment. Spiders had spun thick webs in the corners of the rafters, and the floor was cold and uneven under their boots. Thomas used his large, calloused hands to clear away the broken stone blocks, while Leo carefully stacked the salvaged volumes on a dry stone bench. While using a soft brush to clear the soot from a half-burnt oak window frame, Lavinia's fingers brushed against an unusual gap in the stone wall, behind the main foundation pillar. She noticed that the mortar in this particular spot was loose and crumbling, unlike the solid masonry around it. "Leo, Thomas, help me slide this old oak cabinet aside," Lavinia called out, her gray eyes narrowing in curiosity. Thomas looked at the massive, blackened cabinet, which stood over 7 feet tall. "Miss Montague, that cabinet has sat there for decades. It is incredibly heavy, but let us see if we can move it." With a grunt of effort, Thomas and Leo threw their weight against the wood. The cabinet shifted with a loud, scraping screech across the stone floor, sending up a cloud of dust that set them coughing. Once the wall was exposed, Lavinia used a small chisel to pry away the loose stones. Clang! A large stone block came loose, revealing a dark hidden recess within the wall. Inside the cavity lay a rusted iron box, sealed with red wax bearing the ancient Ravensdale crest-and eagle gripping a broadsword. Lavinia carefully lifted the box and broke the dry wax seal. The scent of old burnt wax rose in the cold air as the seal cracked under her thumb. Inside lay a roll of yellowed parchment and a small bundle of old letters. As Lavinia unrolled the parchment under the dim light, she and Leo gasped in astonishment. It was the original estate settlement deed of the 18th century, legally executed between the late Duke of Ravensdale and her father, Sir Kenneth Montague. The document proved that the Montague estate in Yorkshire had been legally and permanently transferred to the Montague family as a non-entailed trust fund in exchange for their royal glass commissions, rendering it completely immune to debt foreclosure. It bore the late Duke's bold signature and Kenneth's elegant script. Even more shocking were the letters bundled beneath the deed. They were secret correspondences between Lord Archibald and Viscount George Radcliffe. One letter from Archibald read, "The fire at Ravensdale Abbey will destroy all evidence of this deed. You need only accuse Kenneth of ruining the Westminster glass, and I will seize their Yorkshire estate to cover my losses at the London clubs." They had intentionally set fire to the Abbey to destroy the deed, and framed her father to cover their crimes. Archibald's handwriting was shaky and ink-splattered, reflecting his frantic state, while Radcliffe's replies were cold, calculated, and precise. Cecilia whispered, his voice trembled, tears ran down his face. He clutched her sleeve, his small shoulders shaking as his warm tears fell onto the dry, yellowed parchment. Father was innocent, they ruined him and let him die in that dark prison just to steal our home. It was all a lie, he died in the dark while they lived in luxury. Lavinia clutched the parchment to her chest, her eyes flashing with a cold, brilliant resolve. She held her brother close, her own tears burning but held in check. Dry your tears, Leo. This is the evidence that will clear our father's name and reclaim everything they stole from us. Archibald believed the fire had consumed the truth, but the truth has survived within these stone walls. Our father is watching over us. Thomas, who had been watching in silence, looked at the documents with a shocked expression. He fell to one knee before Lavinia, his head bowed. Miss Montague, I was wrong. We were all wrong about you and your father. The guild was lied to. I swear on my life, my men and I will protect you in this project. We will see this window completed, no matter what. Lavinia touched his shoulder gently. Thank you, Thomas. Your support is what we need to see this through. Lavinia carefully placed the documents in the secret compartment of her toolbox. Later that evening, when Dominic visited the workshop to inspect the glass samples, she showed him the Montague design patterns on the old fragments and spoke with quiet meaning. Your Grace, these stained glass windows are more than art. They are silent witnesses to the history and covenants of this land. Sometimes a fire is set not by accident, but to consume the truths written in glass. But stone and glass do not know how to lie. Dominic's sharp mind caught the hidden meaning in her words and the proud look in her eyes. You have uncovered something of great importance beneath the ruins, haven't you, Lavinia? He asked, his gray eyes locking onto hers. Trust in me, I will not allow the truth to be buried again. Keep it safe until the day of judgment. Their unspoken alliance was now forged in stone, ready for the final confrontation in London. Chapter 7. The painful accusation. No sooner had the blizzard cleared than Lord Archibald initiated his most devious plot to expel Lavinia and ruin the Duke's standing. Under the cover of a moonless night, Silas, his shadow long and thin against the wet stone walls of the courtyard, slipped silently into Lavinia's design room. Archibald had promised Silas a small fortune and a fashionable townhouse in Belgravia if he succeeded, a promise Silas knew was likely built on sand, but his financial desperation had blinded him to the risks. In the quiet hours of the night, as he crept through the dark vestry, he could hear his own heartbeat sounding like a drum in his ears. The door creaked, a sound easily swallowed by the roaring sea outside. He moved with a thief's precision, opening drawers, searching through her charcoal drawings, until his fingers closed upon the parchment containing the master sketch of the resurrection window. Next to it lay her small leather-bound formula book, containing the chemical secrets of her cobalt blue glass and the ratios of gold salts for her ruby-red sheets. Simultaneously, Archibald bribed several greedy workers to spread a rumor that Lavinia was an industrial spy sent by Gideon Grimshaw to delay the restoration, ensuring the Duke would lose his inheritance. They whispered in the dark corners of the courtyard, claiming that she was intentionally delaying the project and that her father's spirit was cursed. The next morning, Dominic's study was in absolute chaos. Lord Archibald arrived accompanied by Bow Street runners, representatives of the House of Lords, and magistrates from London. With a look of fake concern, Archibald laid the stolen sketches and forged correspondence on the desk. Your Grace, the woman you have protected is an industrial spy, Archibald announced loudly, his voice echoing off the paneled walls. We found these letters from Grimshaw in her room, along with the stolen designs. She has been deliberately sabotage welding the frames so they will collapse. You must arrest her immediately. Dominic stared at the forged documents, his face expressionless, though his fists clenched under the desk. He realized that if he openly defended her now, the magistrates would immediately execute the arrest warrant, and she would be dragged to a dark London cell before he could prove her innocence. He needed time for his agents to gather proof and trace the path of the bribes. He turned to Lavinia, his gray eyes dark with silent meaning. Miss Montague, given these serious charges, I must act in accordance with the law. You will be confined to the West Tower of Ravensdale Castle until this matter is resolved. Leo Montague will be placed under the housekeeper's supervision in the apprentice's quarters. Lavinia met his gaze, recognizing the defensive tactic he was using to keep her out of a London prison. Yet the public humiliation still stung. She tilted her chin up. Your Grace, the truth may be locked behind the stone walls of the West Tower, but its light cannot be hidden by lies. I accept your confinement, and I trust that true justice will prevail. During her confinement in the freezing tower, Lavinia did not despair. High above the sea, she listened to the gulls and watched the waves. The tower cell was cold and drafty, with a small iron-grated window that looked out over the gray, foaming North Sea. The wind from the sea howled through the narrow, unglazed arrow loops of the stone chamber, bringing with it a fine spray of salty mist that coated everything in a damp film. The straw pallet in the corner of the cell offered little comfort, and the stone fireplace was small and filled with ash. Lavinia did not let the cold stiffen her fingers. She walked the length of the cell to keep her blood flowing, reciting chemical formulas to herself. As the days bled into one another, Lavinia found solace in her work. The tower was not a prison, but a cocoon. She remembered her father's words when he was teaching her about the properties of cobalt. The cobalt blue is the color of the deep sky at twilight, Lavinia. It is a color of peace, but it requires the heat of the furnace to bring out its true depth. But unbeknownst to Archibald, Dominic had ordered his butler to supply her with chemical oxides, silica, and firing tools under the guise of personal effects, turning her quarters into a secret workshop. In the dim candlelight, Lavinia worked through the night, her fingers bleeding and raw from grinding glass in the cold. She used a piece of charcoal from the stove to write out her calculations on the rough stone wall, converting the tower chamber into a laboratory of light. She concentrated on creating the brilliant cobalt blue and ruby red glass using gold salts, which would form the heart of the window, the fire eagle of the Montagues. She knew that only the sheer quality of this glass could clear her father's name and save the Duke. She ground the silica and gold salts, watching the crucible glow yellow hot, knowing that the ruby red glass she was forging would be the heart of the resurrection. The smell of burning charcoal and melted metals filled the small tower room, but she welcomed the warmth of the kiln. Chapter 8, The Dedication Ceremony. The day of the dedication arrived under a clear, crisp winter sky. Carriages carrying London's elite, the House of Lords representatives, and the Archbishop of Westminster arrived at the estate. The road leading to the abbey was lined with carriages of every shape and color: black lacquered landaus, grand barouches with gold leaf, and light curricles driven by the younger lords. The air was filled with the scent of wet horses and expensive perfumes. The elite of London had traveled north, not to celebrate the abbey but to witness the fall of the Duke. Lady Catherine and the Duchess of Devonshire sat in the front pews, their fans fluttering like wings. They whispered behind their lace fans, counting the minutes until the Duke's ruin. Outside the stone walls of the abbey, hundreds of local tenant farmers and their families stood gathered in the freezing air, their breath rising in small gray plumes. They huddled together for warmth, their faces weathered by the harsh northern elements. For generations, their livelihoods had been tied to the Ravensdale estate, and they knew that if Lord Archibald succeeded in taking control, their leases would be doubled and their lives ruined. They watched the arrival of the London magistrates with silent anxiety, praying that the Duke would find a way to preserve their homes. The pews were filled with the whispers of the ton, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic gossip. The Ravensdales have always been proud, Lady Jersey whispered to her daughter, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. But this is a scandal from which they can never recover. To think a common girl from the East End has brought a duke to his knees. Near the altar, the Archbishop of Westminster looked at the heavy leather ledger, his face grave. He knew that the signature he was about to write would seal the fate of one of the oldest families in Yorkshire, transferring their legacy to a known gambler. The interior of the Abbey Chapel was packed with the elite of London, their rustling silk dresses and expensive woolen cloaks filling the pews. The air was thick with the dry scent of incense and the damp chill of the winter morning. Lady Salisbury sat in the second row, her face partially hidden by an emerald green fan as she whispered to Lady Jersey. "It is a tragedy," she murmured. "To see the Ravensdale title brought so low, the Duke is ruined, and the girl will be sent to Newgate." Near the altar, the Archbishop of Westminster sat in his high chair, wearing grand gold-threaded vestments that caught the pale light. In front of him lay a massive leather-bound ledger, where the legal transfer of the estate would be registered. Inside the abbey, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The central Gothic window remained covered by a massive, wind-torn grey canvas. It hung like a shroud, casting a dark shadow over the altar. Lord Archibald stood near the altar, triumphantly addressing the assembly. "My Lord Archbishop, members of the House of Lords, the deadline has arrived. As you can see, the window is empty. The Duke has failed to fulfill his mother's will. I demand that the estate be transferred to my control." The Archbishop sighed, preparing to sign the legal decree. He held the heavy gold-threaded quill over the leather-bound ledger. Suddenly, the great bells of the abbey rang out, shaking the ancient walls. The heavy oak door swung open, and Dominic Ravensdale entered in his full gold-trimmed ducal robes, his presence commanding absolute silence. He wore his grand robes of state, his dark velvet cloak thread with gold. He walked with a warrior's stride, his eyes locked on his uncle. His heavy boots clicked sharply against the stone floor. He walked with the slow, deliberate stride of a soldier, his gaze carrying the weight of a man who had seen the worst of battle, and was prepared to do whatever was necessary to defend his house. The gold embroidery on his cloak caught the pale winter light, making him look like a king returning to his throne. Behind him walked Lavinia and Leo. Lavinia wore a simple blue dress, with Dominic's heavy cloak draped over her shoulders. She carried a wooden chest containing the central glass panes. "Dominic," Archibald shrieked, "you dare bring this criminal here." "Officers, arrest her." Dominic stepped in front of her, his voice booming like thunder. "Silence, Archibald. The magistrates are here for justice, not your lies. My agents have arrested Gideon Grimshaw in London. He has confessed to forging the letters under your direction. We found your letters detailing the plot to burn the abbey and frame Sir Kenneth Montague in your town office. You are under arrest for arson and fraud." Dominic reached into his coat and produced a thick packet of documents, wrapped in black leather and sealed with the royal seal of the Bow Street Court. He handed them directly to the Archbishop. "These are the sworn statements of Gideon Grimshaw, witnessed by the Chief Magistrate of Bow Street," Dominic explained, his voice cold and clear. "They detail the exact payments made by Silas, under Archibald's order to secure the forged papers, and the purchase of the oil used to start the fire. The truth has been documented and verified." The crowd erupted in murmurs of shock as officers moved to arrest the trembling Archibald. Lavinia walked toward the scaffolding, where Thomas and the local workmen stood ready. She looked up at the wind-swept heights, ready to show the world her masterpiece. Chapter 9. The stained-glass climax. The vast stone sanctuary of Ravensdale Abbey fell into a profound, almost sacred silence. The rustle of expensive silk dresses, the quiet shifting of leather boots, and the low, speculative whispers of London's high society ceased entirely, leaving only the sound of the wind. Every eye in the crowded church, from the distinguished members of the House of Lords and the robed magistrates, to the wealthy patrons of Mayfair and the high-ranking clergy, was fixed on the towering wooden scaffolding that rose 30 feet into the air. Lavinia Montague stood on the high platform, a lone figure against the empty sky. The fierce wind from the North Sea rushed through the open stone archway, whipping her long brown hair across her face, and causing the skirts of her cobalt-blue dress to billow around her ankles. Her hands, marked by the scars of her craft and cold from the wind, held the tools of her trade with absolute stability. Thomas and 3 of the strongest local workmen carefully hoisted the heavy central panel of the resurrection scene. The heavy wooden platform swayed slightly in the gusting wind, but Lavinia guided the lead frame into place, her movements precise and deliberate. She could feel the vibration of the wind in the metal, a subtle force that would destroy any glass not properly fitted. In her mind, she carried the memory of her father's hands guiding her own when she was a child, teaching her how to listen to the materials. She used her wooden mallet to tap the lead came joints, ensuring they sat perfectly against the ancient stone window frame, leaving the necessary microscopic gap for the winter contraction. The smell of hot solder and lead flux drifted through the cold air. The heavy wooden frame groaned under the strain, the ropes creaking loudly against the iron pulleys. Thomas shouted instructions to the men below, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Steady now, don't let it swing." Lavinia stood on the edge of the platform, her hand resting on the stone pillar to steady herself. The wind tried to pull her back, but she remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the approaching frame. She could smell the familiar scent of the hot soldering iron and the metallic tang of the flux, a scent that brought back memories of her father's busy workshop at Pembroke. When the frame reached her, she guided it into the groove with a gentle, practiced touch. Down on the stone floor, Lord Archibald Ravensdale pushed past the guards, his face twisted in desperate rage. "This is an outrage," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You are allowing a common girl to install a window without the official seal of the Royal Guild. It is a violation of building codes. She is trying to hide her incompetence by delaying the ceremony. Stop her immediately." Lavinia ignored the shouting. She reached into her toolbox and retrieved the final, most crucial piece of the window, the heart of the fire eagle. This pane was made from the ruby-red glass she had formulated in the quiet of her tower room, using gold salts to achieve a red so deep and vibrant it seemed to burn with its own internal heat. She positioned the ruby glass in the center of the design, right over the chest of the resurrected figure. With a firm, gentle tap of her mallet, the glass slid into place, the joints locking together with a soft, final click. "Lower the canvas." Lavinia commanded, her voice ringing clearly through the vaulted heights of the sanctuary. The workmen cut the heavy ropes, and the massive gray canvas fell away, plunging the assembly into darkness for a fraction of a second before the noon sun struck the window. A brilliant, almost blinding wave of colored light burst through the glass, flooding the dim stone church. The transformation was instantaneous. The cold, gray walls of the abbey were painted in rich, warm hues of ruby red, deep amber, and a blue so intense it mirrored the depths of the ocean. The light filtered through the pure silica glass, casting long, glowing pathways across the stone floor and illuminating the faces of the silent congregation. The light filtered through the pure silica, casting long, glowing pathways across the stone floor that looked like rivers of melted jewels. The red light fell directly upon the white marble tomb of the late Duchess, casting a soft, warm crimson glow that made the statue appear to breathe. The cobalt blue light painted the stone pillars in deep, majestic shadows, while the gold accents glittered like celestial fire. The assembly stood in absolute silence, transfixed by the beauty. The colored beams of light did not merely illuminate the chapel, they seemed to dance, shifting and morphing as the clouds moved across the sun. The deep cobalt blue light pooled on the stone steps of the altar like water, while the crimson light of the fire eagle painted the high arches in strokes of gold and blood. The stone faces of the saints carved into the pillars seemed to come alive, their features softened by the warm colors. It was a display of optical science and high art, a synthesis that was unmatched in all of England. The central figure of the resurrection seemed to step forward from the window, surrounded by the burning wings of the Montague fire eagle. The light fell directly upon the marble statue of the late Duchess, wrapping the cold white stone in a warm, crimson embrace that made her features look soft and alive. The entire cathedral was transformed from a cold ruin into a sanctuary of living color. A collective gasp rose from the congregation. The Archbishop of Westminster stepped forward, his eyes wide with wonder. He raised his hands, his voice trembling slightly. "It is a miracle of light. I have visited the great cathedrals of Europe, yet I have never witnessed such purity of color, such mathematical precision in the alignment of the leads. This is not merely a window, it is a sacred masterpiece. The House of Montague has returned its light to our land." Lord Archibald fell back, his knees giving way as he collapsed onto the stone floor, his silver-tipped cane rolling away into the shadows. The evidence of his defeat was written in the very light that filled the chapel. Dominic Ravensdale climbed the wooden ladder to the high platform. He reached out and took Lavinia's hands, his gray eyes warm with a pride that matched the brilliance of the glass. He unclasped his own heavy velvet cloak and wrapped it around her shoulders, turning to look down at the crowd below. "Lavinia Montague has restored this sanctuary," Dominic declared, his deep voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. "She has done so in the face of lies and slander, From this day forward, she is the Duchess of Ravensdale. Let all of society know that her honor is my honor, and her name is my name." The assembly of nobles, who had once whispered sneers, now bowed their heads in deep respect. The daughter of the disgraced artisan had triumphed, her art shining as a beacon of truth that shattered the darkness of the past. Chapter 10. Society bows down following the breathtaking dedication of the resurrection window. The wheels of justice turned swiftly and relentlessly. Lord Archibald Ravensdale was taken into custody by the Bow Street runners, right within the courtyard of the Abbey, before the eyes of the stunned assembly of London's elite. The evidence compiled by Dominic's agents was absolute. Faced with the prospect of the gallows or lifetime exile, Archibald's manager Silas confessed to everything, revealing the systematic embezzlement, the forged loan agreements, and the deliberate act of arson that had destroyed the Abbey's sanctuary the previous year. Gideon Grimshaw was arrested in his London office that same night, his corrupt workshop seized by order of the Crown, and its profits redirected to compensate the exploited workers of the East End. A formal decree from the House of Lords, signed and sealed by the Lord Chancellor, officially cleared the name of Sir Kenneth Montague. His honor was fully restored, and notice of his innocence was published in the London Gazette, vindicating his life's work. Furthermore, the Montague estate in Yorkshire, a valuable tract of land rich in high-purity silica sand, was returned to Lavinia and Leo Montague, free of all debts and encumbrances. The long night of injustice had finally ended, and the morning light of truth had arrived. A week later, the wedding of Duke Dominic Ravensdale and Lavinia Montague was celebrated at the newly restored Ravensdale Abbey. The harsh northern winter had finally broken, giving way to a warm, gentle spring that covered the Yorkshire cliffs in a blanket of green grass and early wildflowers. The sanctuary was decorated with thousands of white roses, symbolizing the purity of their union, and bundles of dried lavender that filled the stone hall with a sweet, calming fragrance. The deep, resonant tones of the pipe organ filled the space, playing a stately march that echoed through the high vaults, accompanied by the clear, sweet voices of the local chapel choir. The members of Mayfair society, who had once shunned Lavinia and her brother, now stood in silent, respectful rows along the aisle. The very ladies who had mockingly whispered about the destitute glasscutter now wore their finest pastel silks, eager to catch a nod of recognition from the new Duchess. They stood with hands clasped, their eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting to offer their respects. Lavinia walked down the crimson carpet, her arm resting on Dominic's. She wore a magnificent gown of ivory satin, its bodice hand-embroidered with delicate Alencon lace and tiny crystals that caught the light like dew on glass. A veil of sheer silk lace flowed behind her, framing her serene, beautiful face. On her finger, the gold Montague signet ring sat beside the massive Ravensdale diamond, a symbol of two ancient houses united in honor. Her shoulders were straight, her posture proud and graceful, as she walked toward the altar. Dominic looked down at her, his stern features softened by a deep, quiet love that transformed his cold gaze into one of absolute devotion. He was no longer the lonely commander of the battlefield. He had found his anchor. As they stood before the altar, the Archbishop of Westminster raised his hands, beginning the sacred liturgy. The vows they exchanged were not mere standard phrases of duty, but promises forged in the fires of adversity. Lavinia looked up into Dominic's gray eyes, her voice steady and clear as she swore to stand by his side in both light and shadow. When it was Dominic's turn, his deep voice resonated through the stone vaults, carrying a warmth that few had ever heard from the stern Duke. He vowed to defend her honor with all the power of his house, to protect her dreams, and to cherish her as his equal partner. When he slipped the gold band onto her finger, the crowd held its collective breath. Above them, the sun reached its highest point in the sky, and its brilliant spring rays shone directly through the massive resurrection window. The light was magical, the cobalt blue of the sky and the ruby red of the fire eagle's wings projected down upon them, bathing the bride and groom in a warm, colorful glow. The crimson and gold light fell across the train of Lavinia's ivory gown, making the crystals sewn into the fabric gleam like stars. It was as if Sir Kenneth Montague's spirit was present, filtering the light of heaven to bless their union. When the Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife, the church bells rang out once more, their joyous peals echoing across the cliffs and out over the sea. Dominic turned to his bride, a soft, rare smile warming his features, and leaned down to kiss her. It was a gentle, reverent kiss, sealing a covenant that was as strong as the stone walls around them. The new Duke and Duchess of Ravensdale walked hand in hand back down the aisle. The congregation bowed deeply, the Mayfair nobles offering their congratulations with a respect that was now genuine, born of their awe of Lavinia's talent. As they stepped out of the heavy oak doors, into the bright spring sunshine, a massive cheer rose from the thousands of tenant farmers, local craftsmen, and townspeople who had gathered in the courtyard. They tossed handfuls of red rose petals into the air, creating a beautiful shower of color that drifted down over the couple. Thomas, the lead fitter, stood at the front of the crowd, wearing his best coat. He bowed respectfully to Lavinia. "My Lady Duchess," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have brought the light back to Ravensdale, and you have given us all our pride back. It is an honor to serve you." Lavinia smiled warmly at the old craftsman. "Thank you. Thomas, the work we did here is only the beginning. The Abbey stands today because of the precision of your hands as much as the design of mine. We shall build more together." Dominic handed Lavinia into the waiting carriage, a magnificent vehicle of polished black lacquer lined with rich velvet cushions, its doors bearing the combined crest of the Ravensdale Eagle and the Montague Fire Eagle. As the carriage began to roll forward, pulled by 4 sleek black horses, the crowd continued to cheer, waving their hats in the air. Inside the quiet cabin, away from the noise of the crowd, Dominic took Lavinia's hands in his. He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a tenderness that lay beneath his noble exterior. "Lavinia," he began, his voice soft, "when I first saw you in that dark, smoky glassworks in the East End, you stood taller and prouder than any lady in London. I did not realize then that you would not only restore my mother's chapel, but that you would heal the broken parts of my own soul. I spent years in the darkness of war, and then in the cold duty of this estate. You have brought the light back into my life, and you have given me a home. You are the greatest treasure I have ever found." Lavinia squeezed his hands, her eyes bright with love. "Dominic," she replied, her voice soft, "we have both walked through the dark. You protected me when I was accused, and you gave me the freedom to create. We are not savior and victim. We are partners. The storms of the North Sea may howl, but the flame in our hearth and the light in our windows will never be extinguished. We will build a future here that is built on truth." In the weeks that followed their wedding, Lavinia and Dominic began to plan the future of the estate. They decided to establish a free glassmaking academy, which they named the Montague Glass Academy of Yorkshire. Located on the cliffs overlooking the sea, the academy would provide housing, education, and training in the art of stained glass and glass chemistry to impoverished children from Yorkshire and the slums of London, including the East End. They wanted to give children the opportunity to learn a trade and lift themselves out of poverty, just as Lavinia had done. Thomas was appointed as the master lead fitter instructor, and Leo Montague was given his own design studio at the academy, where he would study under his sister and prepare to enter the Royal Academy of Art. As the sun began to set over the North Sea, casting a warm golden light across the cliffs, Leo stood at the window of his studio. He looked out at the carriage returning from the town, and then up at the grand resurrection window of Ravensdale Abbey. The stained glass shone like a beacon in the twilight, its colors rich and vibrant against the darkening sky. It was a monument to the truth, a testimony to the triumph of art and love over the shadows of greed and malice. The legacy of Sir Kenneth Montague was secure, and a new era of light had begun for the houses of Ravensdale and Montague.